Brought to you by Charity Mobile, the phone company that supports life and family. 5% of your monthly plan price goes to your favorite charity. Mention offer code TRADITION for a special Christmas offer. Learn more at CharityMobile.com.
You may be aware that the secular politics and the intersection of the politics of the world and the church has dominated the Catholic news cycle lately. I've live streamed in the last week probably more about secular politics involving the church than I have in the last several years. And unfortunately, that's not going to be letting up anytime soon, because the bishops in America and beyond have been exposed as having profited off of human suffering. I'm certain in the next couple of days I'm going to have another story on this for you, because there are whispers of action being taken by government. And the consequence of all this stuff and the conflict the U.S. bishops are now engaged in with the new administration over their real god, money, unfortunately, that subject will continue to dominate Catholic news headlines. And one consequence of that is the story we're about to talk about has gotten buried at least a little bit in the news cycle. We now have a couple of updates on the Father Marco Rupnik mess. If you don't remember who Father Marco Rupnik was, well, he is a now former Jesuit priest. He was a member of the Jesuit order for decades. He's a late middle-aged man, probably starting to think about his retirement. He's famous for running an art institute in Rome, and he is infamous for some of the really vacant, glassy-eyed images that you see in a lot of Catholic parishes, cathedrals, and basilicas, most famously in America at the Grand Hall of the Knights of Columbus. Rupnik is a favored person in Rome and has been for a very long time. His artwork is iconic in the worst way possible. He has access to Francis directly. And it came out that at least since the late 1980s, he had a, we'll say, taste for nuns, and coerced at least 30 nuns over the course of around 30 years to engage in grotesque sins against the flesh with him. He got them to violate their vows with him. He used the sacrament of penance to hide their misdeeds, their mutual misdeeds. Misdeeds that the nuns have, I would say, limited culpability for because of the coercive nature of what the priest was doing. In so using the sacrament of penance to hide their misdeeds, he automatically incurred excommunication on himself and had been acting as a priest invalidly for who knows how long, since like 1985 or something. Eventually, the story broke in the news. It caused a scandal worldwide. It was so much so that the Jesuits expelled him from the order. The modern Jesuits, the Jesuits of James Martin, okay? That order of Jesuits that said, sins against the flesh aren't that big of a deal. The sin that cries out to heaven for justice that James Martin has a weird fascination with for a Catholic priest, not that big a deal. Scripture got it wrong. St. Paul got it wrong. All that stuff. Those Jesuits, Marco Rupnik was too much for them. And so they expelled him from the order, and more power to them on that one thing. His automatic excommunication was lifted by Francis, and he was reinstated to the clerical state, where he now operates out of Rome, continuing to make art for the church. The first update on this case, because it looked like the Vatican was investigating things, and it looked like they were just kicking the ball down the road, basically kicking the can down the road, saying, oh, we don't have an update yet. We don't have an update yet. And it looked like they were trying to delay things until people forgot about Rupnik and they could then just move on. Well, the first update is about why the authorities in Rome haven't taken this case as seriously as they should. And the second update is that I was wrong. I fully expected the Roman Curia would keep pushing this case back until most people forgot about it and moved on. But it actually looks like Rupnik is going to have his day in the secular courts. We'll see how that plays out. Let's go to the pillar for the first update. So we go, again, the very mainstream Catholic news outlet. The headline, DDF head on Rupnik. Other cases are worse. Now, again, I can't bring myself to describe in any real detail what it was Rupnik forced these nuns to do. But apparently there are worse cases in the Marco Rupnik case. He did unspeakable things to and with nuns. He coerced them into violating their vows with him by using the sacrament of penance to hide his misdeeds and their possibly limited culpability in their participation in these misdeeds and their forced involvement in them. And he engaged in sacrilegious parodies of the Mass with nuns in the most impure way inconceivable. And I downplay the severity of what he did with them involving the Mass because it's so grotesque that no Catholic should ever describe what they did in detail, especially because the incredibly evil and scandalous nature of what they did. The only ones who should ever do that are the lawful authorities among themselves in whatever process they have to do to make sure justice is done. And that's it. I don't think anybody should go into detail in public about what they did. Rupnik was excommunicated automatically for what he did. The DDF confirmed that like 2 years ago. And the modern Jesuits, again, the modern Jesuits that play fast and loose with Catholic morality, they wanted nothing to do with him and expelled him from their order. He was possibly the highest profile Jesuit in the world after Pope Francis. Bear that in mind. Francis reinstated him to the priesthood, lifted the excommunication, what was assumed by most as an act of mercy. And it may have been, at least that may have been part of it. But I think there were other things going on here, and I'm going to touch on that in a moment. But let's get the details about what do you mean there are worse than Rupnik? What do they mean by that? The article, quote, Asked about the timeline of the investigation into Rupnik, reopened by Pope Francis in 2023, Fernandez responded the dicastery he heads has finished gathering information about the case and is now working to create a tribunal. The Cardinal's comments came in a January 23rd interview with the weekly magazine of the Archdiocese of Mid, Alpha E Omega. The interview discussed the DDF's intention to typify the canonical crime of spiritual abuse because, as Cardinal Fernandez explained, quote, many dicasteries continuously receive complaints on situations in which spiritual elements were used as an excuse or motivation to have impure relations by a priest of the catechist, for example. Hear that again. He says that the DDF has gotten many cases where they continue to receive complaints from various places around the world where this is happening. The diabolic disorientation in the church, ladies and gentlemen, the result of it putting in a morally unfit men to the priesthood. The McCarrick problem is not over, folks. It's taken a new twist, but the McCarrick problem is not over. In these cases, there is a manipulation of people who confide in a spiritual guide, and at the same time, a manipulation of the spiritual beauty of our faith to receive the activities suitable to the married state. The DDF announced in November last year that it had commissioned a study group to consider how spiritual mistreatment could be classified as a distinct and particular crime under canon law. Fernandez was asked if there was an urgency to resolve the Rupnik case, which has been criticized for its lengthy delay. He replied, I think of many other cases, including others that are worse but less publicized. Worse than what Rupnik did with nuns in their parody of the Mass. We cannot think of a new law for just one case because that would limit the vision and harm the work's objectivity. With regard to the Rupnik case, the dicastery finished the stage of gathering information, which was in very different places, and conducted a first analysis. Now we are working to constitute an independent tribunal that goes to the last stage through penal judicial procedure, he added. End quote. More on that in a moment. It turns out that Rupnik has deep ties to Francis, extremely deep ties. Francis is a huge fan of Rupnik, and not only because they're both Jesuits. Francis has a track record of protecting wicked priests, but especially Jesuits. There's something much deeper going on here than merely both of them being Jesuits. The European news outlet Mesa in Latino has several stories that I'm going to use here to show you these. So we go here to the first one, because this is just a little weird. Headline from Mesa in Latino: Francis preserves and praises Rupnik's work in his studio. Francis collects Marco Rupnik's art, as you're about to see. He has a collection of this stuff. Here is, for those of you who might not remember Marco Rupnik's artwork, there you go. You see it. It's weird looking. It reminds me of Giger, honestly, if you're familiar with his work. If you ever saw the movie Alien, right, from like the 1970s and 80s, those movies, the monsters in those movies, for some reason, they hit a spiritual chord similar to those creatures in those films. Some people might disagree with me, but there's something deeply unsettling about his artwork. And it's, for some reason, it's odd that Francis likes this stuff. So, from the article, quote, Again, Francis's defense of the wicked protege Marco Rupnik. Francis preserves and praises Rupnik's work in his study. Now, we know that Francis has not gotten rid of the works of the wicked Marco Ivan Rupnik that he personally owns. Today, during his speech to the Roman Curia on the occasion of the audience for the exchange of Christmas greetings, this was dated December 28th, Francis briefly abandoned the text of his speech prepared in advance to make explicit reference, in a positive way, to a painting by Rupnik that he owns in the study, to which he had already referred on to other occasions, particularly in 2023, when he recorded a short video message for the 16th Mariology Congress, the Mariology of Pope Francis in Aparecida, Brazil. Francis said today, quote, "There is an image which I have in my study which represents precisely the syncatabasis. The Virgin is there with her hands as if they were a small ladder, and the child is descending the ladder. The child holds the law in one hand, and with the other he clings to his mother so as not to fall. This is the function of the Virgin, to carry the child and leave him. And this is what she does in our hearts." This is him giving a sort of catechesis on the art of the wicked Father Rupnik. Again, a little weird. From this past Friday, meaning after Fernandez told the media that there were worse monsters than Rupnik in the priesthood, we get another story from Mesa and Latino. So again, this is weird, right? The headline from Friday: more paintings by Rupnik with Francesco. And so if you click here, you'll note the watermark here. That's from Vatican News. This is from an official Vatican news outlet initially. There's a painting of Rupnik's in Francis's own study. And it was shared by Michael Haynes on X. He says, an image made by Father Rupnik can still be seen hanging in Pope Francis's chambers in this new video, his nightly call with priests at a Catholic church in the battle zone in the Holy Land. Francis said in 2018 that another image he has of Mary was a personal gift from Rupnik. Kind of weird, isn't that? Especially since this is right after Cardinal Fernandez spoke about Rupnik and gave an update on what's going to happen to Rupnik. And yes, Francis keeps his art in his office. I mean, what is the thinking behind this? But then again, we're talking about the man who also keeps art depicting Judas and Martin Luther in his office, so keeping Rupnik there puts him in good company. But Francis has a really, really bad track record for everything involving wicked priests who use their office to forcibly get others to engage in sins of the flesh with them. About a month ago, while the world was mostly paying attention to the festivities surrounding the new year, or the aftermath of the political aftermath of the election or whatever, Mesa and Latino gave us another one, again, because the Rupnik story hasn't really gone away. So you go back to them with the headline, Luis Badia, Francis the Roman Curia, hiding using silence and concealment of wrongdoing in the church. Francis said something real weird to members of the Roman Curia. And it made it sound like he does not want stories like this reported. And by stories, I mean new accusations of priests doing wicked things to be reported. I don't know of another way to interpret this, and that clearly neither can the person who wrote this article. But if you can come up with a more charitable way, please let me know in the comments, because I can't come up with one. The Pope's words to the Roman Curia that can be perceived as of hiding, using silence, and the concealment of wrongdoings in the church. They compare this immediately to something he said in 2015 in his famous trip to the United States. He said the sin and crime of physically doing horrible, unspeakable things to the most young must no longer be a secret and a shame, he said in 2015, fall of 2015 when he came to the U.S. We have been notified, even in rather harsh tones, and among our attentive readers this time, the priests have largely prevailed, of some words of the Holy Father addressed to the Roman Curia on the occasion of Christmas greetings and pronounced last Saturday, December 21st. Again, this is from a month ago. Those that have reached us are correct and necessary observations, which we share. In fact, what the Pope said cannot be passed off as nothing had happened, even if one believes that the speech is interesting and useful. Even in the most beautiful speeches, unacceptable things can be said, as in this case. Obviously, the usual press pretended not to have understood or not to have heard. But what did Pope Bergoglio say that really irritated so many people? And as an aside, many Americans are not used to seeing a Pope's given name being used, but in Europe it's very common, and this is a European news outlet. Here's Jorge Mario Bergoglio's reflection. Brace yourself for this one. Quoting him directly. He who exercises himself in the virtue of accusing himself and practices it constantly becomes free from suspicion and distrust and leaves room for the action of God, the only one who creates the union of hearts. And so, if each one progresses on this path, a community can be born and grow in which all are guardians of one another and walk together in humility and charity. So far, fine. When one sees a defect in a person, one can speak about it only with three people: with God, with the person himself, and if one cannot with that person, with someone in the community who can take care of him, and nothing more. Take this in the context of Marco Rupnik. Imagine handling a McCarrick or Rupnik or Maciel or somebody like that, where the person who discovered things were happening only speaks about it with three people: in prayer, with Maciel or McCarrick or Rupnik, and if you can't with that person, then someone in the community, maybe the local bishop overseeing all of this, and no one else. Think about that for a moment. Goes on. Though these bold words of the Pope were not the written text prepared by the experts of the Secretariat of State, meaning he spoke them off the cuff. As the videos show, they were spoken off the cuff, improvised outside the prepared text, and a part of those innumerable circumstances in which the pontiff has made imprecise, inappropriate, and simply incorrect statements. In this case, we want to think and believe that it was yet another superficiality on his part. Those who took care of transcribing all the Pope's improvisations should have been more incisive in pointing out to the person responsible for the papal text online to be careful about these off-the-cuff words. Why? Because Pope Bergoglio proposes as the supreme line of conduct what has served for decades to hide many misdeeds in the Church, including dramatically abuse of the flesh, ranging from that P word in the clergy to the behavior of the so-called crimes of mysticism of the flesh, such as the Rupnik case and other lesser-known ones. And it goes on to tell you how grossly inappropriate it is to hear the Roman pontiff saying stuff like that. Duh. In the aftermath of not just Rupnik, but Maciel and McCarrick, that is his advice is basically don't tell anybody. Remarkable. Bear that in mind, because all of this has led to this update. And I desperately want to take this at face value. We have an update in the Marco Rupnik case. Finally, it looks like he may face justice. And I remember saying to you just weeks ago that I expected them to kick the can down the road on this story. Again, here's the story of Marco Rupnik, sanitized. Longtime Jesuit priest, responsible for the most high-profile art these days in the Church, the vacant, glassy-eyed, to me, Giger-esque art that you see in a lot of things, including for like Jubilee years for the Vatican. You see the art all over the Vatican, in John Paul II's shrine. You see it in the Knights of Columbus Hall in the United States, the Fatima Shrine, Padre Pio's shrine. Anywhere you can really name that are high-profile pilgrimage sites in the United States or Europe, including the Vatican, Father Rupnik has his art there. He coerced nuns to do unspeakable deeds with him, violations of their vows. And they did engage in parodies of the Mass in that way. And that's all I'll say on that, because I can't bring myself to describe it. It's so grotesque. He incurred automatic excommunication for what he did. He used the sacrament of penance to hide the deeds with the nuns. And as a consequence of that, he incurred automatic excommunication, which, when this all came to light, was upheld by the Vatican. And prior to it being upheld by the Vatican, the Jesuits kicked him out of their order. Francis then reinstated him to the priesthood, lifted the excommunication. And many bishops around the world said, we're not going to get rid of his art out of our various places because it's so expensive. Even though people are mortified when they walk into a place and see his artwork. We have the update from Info Católica, which I believe is out of Spain. The headline: Rupnik to be tried by an independent court. Now that's good news, right? Independent court. You would think that that's good news, and hopefully it is. But in the aftermath of what happened to Cardinal Pell, I would really hope that observers are watching for wire transfers to that country from the Vatican and to the various jurisdictions there from the Vatican or from local dioceses to any place where this is going to happen. Sorry to be suspicious about these things, but after Cardinal Pell, what they did to him, I can only be suspicious. Because it bears saying again, Francis brags about the art he has of this man in his office. He teaches catechesis to people on the cuff about what the art means. And he's the one who lifted the excommunication for him. Now, it could very well be that after this independent process is done, Father Rupnik will have his excommunication put back in place and he'll be dismissed from the priesthood. Pray that that happens. And also remember, I'm not doing a very good job of this. I try to remember that it's an old Catholic principle that people are innocent until proven guilty. So if he is actually truly innocent of this, then pray that the evidence for that comes out. But this is all just some fabrication. But I don't see how this is a fabrication. There have been too many people have come forward saying that this is the case with him. Let's get some details from this article. Quote, Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, prefect of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, has assured that the preliminary investigation into the case of former Jesuit Marco Rupnik is concluded, and that independent tribunal is being formed to move forward to the judicial phase. He made this statement in an interview given on January 23rd to the Spanish media. Alpha Omega, where he noted that this new stage seeks to take the case to a criminal judicial procedure. Rupnik, a Slovenian priest known for his work as an artist, faces multiple accusations of spiritual, psychological, and of the flesh misuse, as well as the abuse of conscience towards religious women under his direction. The first findings emerged from an investigation by the Society of Jesus in 2019. And in 2020, he was excommunicated for absolving an accomplice in confession of a sin against the Sixth Commandment. However, the excommunication was quickly lifted by Pope Francis in a decision that is certainly incomprehensible. Despite his expulsion from the Jesuit order in June 2023 for disobedience to his superiors, Rupnik continues to serve as a priest without restrictions and resides at the Aletti Art Center in Rome, which he founded. He was incardinated in the Slovenian Diocese of Corpera in 2023. Some of his works have been removed around the world, but the Vatican still displays his art on its website and in official spaces, including Pope Francis's personal apartment. Cardinal Fernandez stressed in the interview that the Rupnik case is just one of many involving misdeeds of a spiritual kind, a phenomenon in which spirituality is used as a pretext for relations of the flesh. In these cases, people who trust a spiritual guide are manipulated, and the spiritual beauty of our faith is also disordered in order to attain these kinds of activities, the Argentine cardinal explained. End quote. So he's going to face justice by an independent tribunal. What he doesn't make clear is if this is going to be a Vatican tribunal, and if it is, how independent can they possibly be? This Vatican has surrendered most of its credibility on this. Francis protecting this priest, keeping him incarnated. If he had allowed him to have his faculties as a priest pending the result of this, but kept him in the Vatican to offer private masses, basically, and do whatever, basically under supervision, that might be one thing. Again, innocent until proven guilty. It's an old Catholic principle. Where do you think the secular world got it from? Right? They actually got it from the Inquisition. If you don't know this, back during the bad old days, we're told, of the Inquisition in Spain and other places, there were a lot of times where common criminals would do something to make it so that their case would be taken by the Inquisition because they get a fairer shake there. I know that's weird to hear given how we're taught about them in history, but one of those principles was that conviction had to have a pretty high bar because of the need for evidence and the presumption of innocence. And part of that is because the Inquisitors were believing Catholics. They believed that they'd stand before our Lord and have to answer for any injustice and miscarriage of justice they did. But these days, the Vatican doesn't have that kind of credibility. Francis has a long track record of bringing priests and bishops who face some nasty accusations in Argentina and other places to Rome to work in the Roman Curia. It's a long track record. Bishop named Zqueta from Argentina is the highest profile of all of them before Rupnik. And of course, also Ted McCarrick. Because as it was revealed recently, Francis was given a document by Benedict XVI about McCarrick and everything else, and he did nothing with it. It's part of Francis's track record back to the beginning. So if this is an independent tribunal in the Vatican, how is this going to be possibly be truly independent? Traditional Catholic says ecclesiastical courts are more humane than the secular courts. Oh boy, howdy. If you read the things that were done by the secular courts in the so-called Dark Ages, those were the secular courts. Those weren't the church courts. If you had to be given the ultimate penalty, you wanted to be done by a church court, not by the secular courts, because that was all the horror stories you hear from that time period. That was the secular courts. So pray that this happens, though, that this investigation and this tribunal is truly independent, and that the truth of the matter can come out and true justice can be done. The Rupniks story needs to be handled properly, because as Cardinal Fernandez said elsewhere recently, there are worse out there than him. The mind boggles at that if you know the details of what Marco Rupnik did. Let me know what you think of this in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So does sharing this on social media. That helps a lot too. And if you've ever thought about supporting the work of Return to Tradition, now is a great time to do it. Your support helps keep these daily messages coming. Patreon, Subscribe Star, all that stuff's in the description box below, or that join button does help a lot. And as always, pray for the church and for Marco Rupnik. If he is truly guilty of the things that he is said to be guilty of, then he needs your prayers. Our Lord commanded us to pray for our enemies. And I have a hard time envisioning anybody as my enemy, but somebody who does those kinds of things to nuns, if those accusations are true, probably ranks among them. So please pray for him. He needs it. He needs it more than almost anybody else you can think of right now. And again, as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.